The fact of the matter is, I think we have to put this into context right now. As I've said already, international travel to the UK has declined dramatically by 99%. There are some very clear exemptions that are being, that list is being published this afternoon. Critical workers, infrastructure workers, key categories are there. These measures will be kept under review, and I really do want to emphasise that. We are not shutting down completely. We are not closing our borders, and I think that people need to recognise that. What we are seeking to do is we are seeking to control the spread of the virus, because we do not want a second wave of this virus. And if I may, before I hand over to Patrick Gordon, there are some other points here to note as well. This will come in place on the 8th of June, and between now and then we'll be working with various industries, but also we will continue to work across government, with Public Health England, with the Department of Health and Social Care, to look at, track and trace, testing. By the time this comes together, we would love to have, and of course we want to have, a plethora of tools that can effectively support these measures of quarantining, but also post these measures, help us to look at how we can, in this measured and responsible way, open society in the long course, so much longer term, but in the right way, obviously based upon the science, based on driving the R value down in the United Kingdom. But first and foremost, we must prevent a second wave of this disease, and that's why we're bringing these measures in from the 8th of June. Arrivals will be required to provide contact and address details to help trace them should we need to. And given the amazing public spirit and the level of compliance we have seen so far, we expect the vast majority of people to do the right thing and comply with these new requirements. We know that the vast majority of people will continue to act responsibly to control the spread of this virus and to stop a second wave. But we will not allow a small minority, a reckless minority, to endanger us all. So there will be penalties for those who break these mandatory measures. Border Force will be on the front line of implementing the changes with spot checks as people arrive in the UK. And Paul Lincoln, the Director General of Border Force, will shortly speak to us, and he'll provide an update on the steps that people will need to take. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our Border Force staff and our officers for the role that they will play, and for all that they are doing to protect our nation at this deeply challenging time. We are working across all 4 nations of the UK to make these public health measures work, but I'll now turn to the enforcement approach that is being taken here in England. We will conduct spot checks by mid-June to ensure that people are self-isolating, and those from overseas who refuse to comply could be refused entry. Public Health England will set up an assurance service to contact people at random to ensure that they understand the requirements and to also ensure that they are self-isolating. And our outstanding police will continue to do as they've done diligently across the country to engage, explain, and encourage people to follow the rules. We will empower them to use enforcement as the last resort. So anyone breaking their 14-day quarantine could face a penalty of £1,000, and that will be a fixed penalty notice. And ultimately, that could also go into potential prosecution and an unlimited fine for failure to comply with these sanctions. We will keep these penalties under review and will be unafraid to increase them if that is required. But have no doubt we are taking these measures at the right time because we're serious about saving lives and controlling the virus. And we will be guided by the science, and the public health of the public and the country will always come first, which is why we are implementing these restrictions at the border now. Our absolute priority remains to stop the spread of this infection, to save lives, and to stop and prevent a second dangerous wave of this virus. That also means supporting our NHS and making short-term sacrifices together to stop coronavirus taking more lives. I'm now going to hand over to Paul Lincoln from Border Force, who will update us. He'll provide an operational update, but also talk about the measures and how they will be implemented. Thank you.
Turning to the new measures that the Home Secretary just announced, however, there are 5 key points which I want to make. First is that we're ramping up communications to make sure that anyone travelling into the UK is aware of the changes and the self-isolation measures which will be put in place. Second, we'll be asking people to provide their contact details, travel plans and details of the accommodation where they will be self-isolating using an online form before travel, provided they are not in one of the exempted groups. The exempted groups are primarily to meet the UK's international obligations, to provide for continued security of supply into the UK, and not to impede work such as national security or critical infrastructure. The full list will be published shortly on gov.uk, but the list of those not required to self-isolate includes those such as road haulage and freight workers to ensure the supply of goods is not impacted, and medical professionals who are travelling to help with the fight against coronavirus. Foreign officials who come to the United Kingdom to work on essential border securities, such as the French police who operate in our controls. And in the recognition of the unique nature of the common travel area, as well as the unique position of Northern Ireland, all journeys from within the common travel area will also be exempt. Obtaining people's contract details, onward travel plans for Public Health England and for the devolved administrations will support the test, track, trace and equivalent devolved administration programmes. The more rapidly we can identify and contact those at risk of infection, the more effectively we can reduce the spread of the virus. Third, at the border, there will be spot checks conducted by Border Force officers. Any obvious errors will trigger a requirement for the passenger to complete another form or potentially be refused entry into the UK. Fourth, passengers will then be required to go to their place of self-isolation. And finally, as the Home Secretary mentioned, there is the question of enforcement, with the potential penalties for non-compliance of £100 for the fixed penalty for failing to complete the form, and £1,000 for breaching the terms of self-isolation. And in extreme circumstances, Border Force officers do reserve the right to refuse entry to any non-British or non-residents who do not follow these regulations. Given the high levels of compliance to date, we expect the vast majority of people will take this seriously and do the right thing. We will, however, take enforcement action against a small minority of people who may disregard these actions and therefore further endanger people's lives. The advice is quite clear. If you have the virus, or if you're displaying symptoms, or if you've been in contact with somebody with the virus, you should not travel. To do so otherwise is potentially putting people's lives at risk. We recognise, as the Home Secretary has said, that bringing these measures into force, there are sectors such as the travel industry who may have concerns, and we'll be working with them on the detailed implementation in the coming days, and we will also keep the measures regularly under review. We all look forward to a time when travel is fully back up and running, and when it is, Border Force stand ready to provide a warm welcome to the UK. In the meantime, it is essential that we use the levers at our disposal to ensure the safety of our communities while still facilitating in the critical trade into this country.